What you are about to hear contradicts everything official science has taught you about who you are. For decades, we have been conditioned to believe that consciousness is a product of the brain, that your thoughts, your emotions, your sense of existing, all of it is merely the result of neurons firing in electrical patterns inside an organ that weighs roughly 3 pounds. That when that organ stops, you stop. That you are, in essence, biology. Nothing more. But what if that assumption was never actually proven? What if it was repeated so often that it began to sound like truth without ever having been definitively verified? Because if the brain does not produce consciousness, if it only filters it, the way a radio tunes into a frequency that already exists in the air, then everything you believe about identity, about death, about the limits of what you are, is incomplete, and perhaps radically incomplete. Today, you will explore why this hypothesis is gaining ground both inside and outside of science, why it unsettles so many people, and why, at its core, it may be the most liberating idea you have ever encountered. For centuries, natural philosophy and later modern science were built upon a premise that was rarely questioned, that matter is primary. The physical world exists first, and everything else, including the mind, experience. And consciousness arises as a consequence of that material foundation. This view, known as materialism or became so dominant in Western thought that it stopped being treated as a philosophical hypothesis and began to be presented as established scientific fact. The problem is that it was never proven as such. It is a presupposition, an interpretive choice about the nature of reality, not a conclusion drawn from irrefutable evidence. What neuroscience has demonstrated with extraordinary rigor is that there is a correlation between brain states and states of consciousness. When certain regions of the brain are activated, certain types of experience occur. When the brain is damaged, aspects of consciousness are altered. This correlation is real, documented, and remarkable. But the fact that two things appear together does not mean that one creates the other. It may be that both are produced by something larger. It may be that one filters or manifests the other in a specific way. Neuroscience has mapped the control panel with great precision, but it has not answered where the pilot comes from. And there's something even more uncomfortable about this assumption. It was normalized without sufficient debate. Generations of students learned in universities around the world that consciousness is an epiphenomena of the brain, a byproduct of neural activity, the way heat is a byproduct of friction. Few professors presented this as a theory still under dispute. Most presented it as consensus. And when an assumption is repeated with the voice of scientific authority for long enough, it becomes invisible. Not because it is true, but because no one questions it anymore. But now comes the part that almost no one considers. In 1995, philosopher David Chalmers introduced a distinction that divided the field of cognitive science in a way that has yet to be resolved. He separated what he called the easy problems of consciousness from the hard problem. The easy problems, which are not actually easy but are technically approachable, involve explaining how the brain processes information, controls behavior, and integrates sensory data. They are complex problems, but science has tools to tackle them. The hard problem is something else entirely. It is the question of why there is subjective experience at all. Why there is something it is like to be you, looking outward from the inside, feeling, perceiving, existing as a unique point of view in the universe. No model of information processing, however sophisticated, answers that question. You can describe in microscopic detail what happens in a person's brain when they see the color red, which photons hit the retina, how signals travel through the optic nerve, which areas of the visual cortex are activated, but none of those descriptions capture what it is like to experience red. That gap between the physical process and the lived experience is what Chalmers called the hard problem, and it remains open. Not because science has not gotten there yet, but because the tools of materialism appear to be structurally inadequate to answer it. Some of the most respected neuroscientists and philosophers of mind in the world acknowledge this impasse. Francis Crick, who spent decades studying consciousness after co-discovering the structure of DNA, died without resolving this problem. Krzysztof Koch, one of the most rigorous researchers in the field, publicly admitted that the question of subjective experience may be the greatest mystery in science. What this impasse suggests is not that science has failed, but that the conceptual framework within which the problem was placed may have been wrong from the very beginning. And there is something even deeper than this recognized impasse. Imagine a radio When you tune into a frequency and hear music, would it be accurate to say the radio is producing the music? In a narrow technical sense, yes, it converts electromagnetic signals into audible sound waves. But the music does not exist because the radio exists. It was already there as a signal in the air, independent of the device. The radio makes it accessible at a particular point in space. It is a receiver, not a source. Now apply that structure to the brain. What would change in your understanding if the brain were fundamentally a receiver of consciousness rather than its generator? This metaphor is not new. William James, one of the founders of modern psychology, proposed as far back as the late 19th century that the brain might function as a transmitting or filtering organ for consciousness rather than its producer. Ingi Bergson, a French philosopher of enormous influence, developed a similar idea that the brain restricts and funnels a much vaster field of consciousness, so that ordinary conscious experience is a compressed, utilitarian version of something immeasurably larger. Both arrived at these ideas not through mysticism, but through rigorous philosophical analysis of the limits of the materialist model. What makes this hypothesis particularly powerful is that it is compatible with all available empirical evidence. All the data on the correlation between brain states and states of consciousness fits equally well within a filter or receiver model. If the brain filters consciousness, then brain damage would restrict access to certain aspects of it, just as damage to a radio distorts or blocks certain frequencies. This does not require abandoning neuroscience. It requires expanding the interpretive framework within which it operates. And when that expansion happens, the question that emerges is more radical than anything materialism has dared to ask. But this is only the beginning. If the brain is a receiver of consciousness and not its producer, then consciousness exists independently of the brain. It does not begin with the birth of a body and does not end with its death. What we call death would be, from this perspective, not the end of consciousness, but the end of a particular form of access to it. The way turning off a device does not extinguish the signal it was transmitting. This implication is so enormous that many people reject it, not because it is logically impossible, but because it radically contradicts the worldview they absorbed throughout their entire lives. And contradictions of that magnitude are frightening. But there is more? If consciousness is a primary field, prior to matter and not derived from it, then identity must also be rethought. What you call I may not be identical to the body or the brain you inhabit. It may be a particular, temporary, and localized expression of something far more vast. Spiritual traditions across the world, from radically different cultures separated by millennia, have converged on structurally similar conclusions that individual consciousness is a wave in an ocean, not an isolated drop. Conventional neuroscience has never been able to explain why so many independent traditions arrived at the same conclusion. A model of consciousness as a primary field makes that convergence far less surprising. Phenomena such as near-death experiences, lucid visions during cardiac arrest, out-of-body experiences documented in controlled clinical settings, and reports of verifiable perception during periods when the brain showed no measurable activity. All of these are uncomfortable anomalies within the materialist model. They do not prove that consciousness survives the body, but they place growing empirical pressure on the model that insists it cannot. Researchers such as Pim van Lemmen, a Dutch cardiologist who published studies on near-death experiences in high-impact scientific journals, including The Lancet, concluded that the data is difficult to explain without considering the possibility that consciousness operates in a way not entirely dependent on brain activity. This is not mysticism. It is scientific honesty in the face of evidence. The dominant model cannot accommodate if all of this points to something real. The consequences for everyday life are profound and practical. The fear of death, which invisibly shapes so many of our choices, so much of our suffering, so much of our inability to live fully in the present, rests on the premise that death is the absolute end of everything you are. If that premise is in doubt, then the fear that flows from it is to, not because you now have certainty that you survive death, but because the certainty that you do now is an illusion dressed up as scientific fact. And illusions, once recognized as such, lose their power. The rigid sense of identity, that feeling of being a fixed, bounded self, separate from everything and everyone, also begins to dissolve within this perspective. If consciousness is a field and you are a localized expression of that field, then the boundary between what is you and what is everything else is functional, not until it exists for the purposes of navigating the physical world, not as the final truth of what you are. And when that boundary becomes more permeable, attachment, isolation, and the feeling of being fundamentally alone begin to transform. Purpose reconfigures itself as well. If you are not merely a biological organism trying to survive and replicate its genes, if you are an expression of a field of consciousness exploring itself through individual forms, then the question, "Why am I here?" ceases to be an anguished question and becomes a living one. Open, generative. It is not a question that demands a final answer. It is a question that transforms the way you inhabit every moment. The brain does not produce consciousness, or perhaps it does. The question is still open. And anyone who tells you otherwise, in either direction, is selling you certainty where there is mystery. What this video set out to do was not to convince you of an answer, but to show you that the question is far larger than you were taught to believe, and that big questions, when taken seriously, change people from the inside out. So here's the question that remains. If consciousness exists before the body, if it does not begin with birth and does not end with death, what exactly are you? Not as a metaphor, not as spiritual comfort, as a real hypothesis, one that changes what you do tomorrow morning. If that resonates, there is something even more radical to investigate. Because if consciousness is prior to matter, then the next question is, where does it come from? What is this field? And how can you, right now, access it directly without any intermediary? That is what we will explore in the next video. If this video touched something in you, share it with someone who is also asking these questions. Leave a comment with what stayed with you. And if you are not yet part of this community, now is the moment. Every video here is a step in a larger investigation, one you do not have to make alone.